Hello, everybody. Welcome to our TRC webinar. We're going to give everybody about 1 more minute to log in, and then we'll get started. Okay, everybody, we are at the start of the webinar. So first of all, thank you so much for everyone for attending. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please try to use the questions section, or we can potentially see them in the chat, but typically questions, the questions section is the best way to kind of get those answered. We will try to get back to anyone who has a question, even if we don't cover them today during the live broadcast, because we also did get some questions in advance. So we might not get to everything, just full disclosure. We're excited to have you all here today. We have a nice mix of electric and gas utilities with a nice representation across the country, spanning IOUs to co-ops and municipal utilities. With some representation from the national labs, and then also some of our fellow utility service providers joining us as well. So we're really excited to have you all join us today. Now, this is just a mild disclaimer that we are required to show before any of our webinars. So any of you in the regulatory space, you're probably familiar with this kind of thing. So now a little bit about TRC, and we won't cover this too much, but we are more than 6,000 employees spread over about 140 offices, mostly in the US, but also in Canada, the UK, and China. A strong focus on environmental and digital technologies in the markets that you see on the screen, but not limited to those, of course. So now getting into our presentation topic, we're super excited to have our special guest today, Jigar Shah. Jigar is currently director of the Loan Programs Office of the US Department of Energy, also known as LPO. LPO is responsible for more than 40 billion in loans and loan guarantees to help deploy large-scale energy infrastructure projects. Jigar was also co-founder and president at Generate Capital, where he focused on helping entrepreneurs accelerate decarbonization solutions through low-cost infrastructure as a service financing. He also founded Sun Edison, a company that pioneered pay-as-you-save. Sorry, everybody. Founded pay-as-you-save solar financing, and served as the founding CEO of the Carbon War Room, a global nonprofit founded by Sir Richard Branson and Virgin Unite to help entrepreneurs address climate change. He holds a BS from the University of Illinois UC and an MBA from the University of Maryland College Park. I'm also excited to introduce my TRC colleagues today who will help us navigate the discussion and provide some initial content. Maddie Emerson is a Strategy and Regulatory Associate Manager in TRC's Advanced Energy Practice. She's based out of St. Louis, Missouri, and she supports initiatives to drive decarbonization. Rich Luong is a senior consultant within TRC's Digital Solutions Practice, and he's based out of Seattle. And he has over 15 years of experience in the utility industry in all of the different capacities that you see on the screen there. Oh, so now I'm going to turn it over to Maddie, who will lead us into the meat of the presentation today. Thank you. And take over.
Thanks, Casey. Very glad to be here with you all. And I know we're looking forward to hearing from our guest and addressing some of the questions that y'all have submitted in advance. So I'll just jump right into it. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, IIJA, if you will, also referred to as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or BIL, was signed into law in November of last year, authorizing reportedly about $1.2 trillion in funding, really about $550 million in new spending, but definitely not undercutting the significance. This was characterized by the White House as, quote, a once-in-a-generation investment that will create millions of jobs modernizing our infrastructure, turn the climate crisis into an opportunity, and put us on the path to win the economic competition for the 21st century. So as you can see, the major components here, and most of this spending will take place over the next 5 years. And in line with the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative, there are guidelines in place and that are being developed to for many of these programs to ensure a focus on spending that benefits underserved and rural communities. And as you can see highlighted, we'll focus today on opportunities within clean energy and power, transportation electrification, and resilience, while noting some others that may be of interest to energy utilities such as broadband and environmental remediation. And within each of these opportunity areas, eligible uses of funds will vary, but there are funds available to offset both capital and operational expenditures. So to give us a sense of the opportunities on the table specifically for utilities, I'll hand it over to Rich. If we can go to the next slide.
Thanks, Maddie. So to further delve into the infrastructure law, I'd like to go over some of the major themes of the law to help folks understand some of the underlying intent of the programs that are applicable to utilities. Some of the objectives in the bill include deploying proven technologies that will last for decades to come, making systems resilient against weather, cyber attacks, and other catastrophic failures, addressing climate change and pushing technologies that can help states, utilities, and the US as a whole achieve climate goals, building out a national electric vehicle charging network, and ensuring that all Americans have reliable, high-speed internet access. Many of the programs in the infrastructure law revolve around these themes, and it's important to keep them in mind when considering whether or not a project may qualify for programs under IIJA. Maddie, can you lead us through some of the regulatory ramifications on the next slide?
Yes, thank you. And I'm assuming that y'all have joined us today because you're genuinely interested and excited about pursuing these opportunities. But if by chance your boss, a colleague, or a client encouraged you to join this call, I will break the news that today is not the last day that you will be asked or perhaps forced to think about some of these things. To start, there were requirements within the law itself for state utilities commissions and their regulated utilities, as well as non-regulated utilities, to give some official consideration over the coming year or so to doing more with respect to both demand response and transportation electrification. We know these processes will likely be as meaningful as you and your regulatory stakeholders desire to make them, but they will have to occur if you meet the description set out in the law. Additionally, state commissions like that of North Carolina may take it upon themselves to open additional working dockets and require utilities to take a more comprehensive look at this law to ensure that customers are seeing the reliability and economic benefits that it promises. And this kind of proactive assessment of newly available funding sources and their alignment with your plans, whether it's required or not, can help us head off any added complexity and possible delays in our projects that are linked to these emergent opportunities. So keeping with that North Carolina example, the Utilities Commission asked Duke to spend 6 months or so with stakeholders refining a proposal for a second phase of EV pilots. They did so, filed a plan, went through a comment process, and when it came time for a commission order, the commission effectively said, we acknowledge the work that you've done, but given this unique time we're in, please go back and reconsider all of this in light of IIJA and get back to us within 90 days. So delaying implementation of those proposed pilots for who knows how long. And North Carolina is not an isolated example. Similarly, in my own state of Missouri, over the past year or so, there has been a proposed, recently approved in part, transportation electrification portfolio before the commission, which has been extended and complicated by several factors, but one important one being what stakeholders have continually referred to as a wild card in the deck regarding the emergent federal funding opportunities and how those would be applied. So I make these points not to be a glass half empty person, but first to commend you all on taking a proactive approach to examining how these federal funding opportunities align with your needs and goals, because that's clearly what regulators are finding to be in the best interest of your customers. And secondly, to demonstrate that beyond today, the best way to avoid having our plans kicked out and to avoid being told to go back to the drawing board is by taking this informed, intentional, collaborative approach to pursuing initiatives of interest. And I can kick it back to Rich for more on what that looks like.
Thanks, Maddie. And I think these are some great points that you brought up. And I think it's important that as the utilities look at these opportunities, they should also evaluate how they might be able to benefit from these programs. The infrastructure law presents opportunities for utilities to either fund projects already in the pipeline accelerate projects, and or subsequently free up capital for other projects, as well as reevaluate the viability of projects that may have been put on the back burner. Looking at these opportunities from different angles in terms of financial impact can definitely change how a utility may want to approach their consideration of what to apply for. Moving to the next slide, we just wanted to highlight a few of the programs funded under IIJA that are applicable to utilities and co-ops. Of particular interest are the programs on the left, which are all a part of the Building a Better Grid initiative that the DOE released a notice of intent for back in January. One program on this list I'd like to note is the Transmission Facilitation Program. According to Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary Mannery at the DOE, there will be a notice of intent coming out in the coming weeks that will detail the requirements and next steps for this particular program. So that's an opportunity where utilities and other interested parties should consider responding to the NOI and put together a plan and business case for the response. Another program of particular note is the deployment of technologies to enhance grid flexibility, which is funded for $3 billion over the next 5 years and expands the Smart Grid Investment Matching Grant Program that was established in 2007. So this expansion now allows for the inclusion of fiber and wireless broadband to support data sharing between distribution system components, devices and software to support demand response, and technology to integrate electric vehicles into the grid, in addition to transmission technologies that increase the operational transfer capacity of transmission networks. So that's an example of where there's a big difference between how these programs will be administered today versus when smart grid funding was available in the past over a decade ago under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. The DOE is making significant changes internally, hiring hundreds of people, reorganizing their offices in order to be very deliberate in their choice of projects to fund, and that they meet the DOE's overall strategic goals of clean energy and resilience. Whereas in the past, the DOE was trying to get funding out as quickly as possible to help stimulate the economy, today they're going to take their time to ensure funded projects will have long-lasting impacts with proven technologies that are unlikely to fall to quick obsolescence. Other opportunities are shown here that revolve around energy storage and carbon capture demonstrations, and there's been a lot of motion regarding hydrogen projects and areas in the country vying to receive funding as a hydrogen hub. A major goal for all of these programs is to push climate change solutions to be implemented on a larger scale, recognizing that meeting clean energy goals in the power sector won't be a singular approach. Another point of emphasis I'd like to make is that some programs may not target utilities as a recipient, but will require utilities to work with other entities on these opportunities. A few examples are in alternative transportation, where funding is targeted to states, localities, and other governmental entities, but will need cooperation and coordination with utilities. And Maddie, I know you're pretty knowledgeable about these alternative transportation programs as well as the energy efficiency program, so can you give us a little more info about them?
Sure, thank you. Yes, as Rich mentioned, my own background is in energy efficiency work with utilities, so I was very excited to see a lot in this law related to demand side management, or DSM, including but certainly not limited to the few examples in this section, as well as a couple of others on this slide about technology to enable demand flex and energy improvements in rural and remote areas. So a lot of overlap here, but I'll just elaborate on a few examples. First, the Energy Efficient Transformer Rebate Program is one where we saw draft guidance published this month. So that's $10 million available on a first come, first served basis for qualifying efficient transformer upgrades. And utilities are eligible to be direct recipients of those funds. And as Rich mentioned, we also have a variety of programs for which utilities are not eligible as direct recipients, but meriting inclusion here because the eligible projects will have considerable overlap with the projects that also qualify for many of your own incentive and rebate programs. So energy efficiency upgrades in federal facilities, in residences owned or occupied by low-income persons, in industrial facilities, public schools, all big ones. So thinking about how you can best support your customers in stacking those funds and being prepared for an uptick in those kinds of projects that we hope these programs will spark. Along similar lines, the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program. These funds will flow directly to states, tribes, and local governments. I know we have a few of those local government folks joining us today. And for those familiar with the program last time around with the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, just a disclaimer that this is not at the scale that it was back then, but still $550 million. And eligible uses of these funds include offering programs to provide rebates and incentives to customers for adopting efficiency, renewable energy, or zero emission transportation measures. So again, to all utilities, ensuring that those efforts are coordinated with your existing offerings. And lastly, in this category, for those utilities involved in efforts to support and develop the clean energy workforce, often tied to your DSM efforts, this was a big theme in the law as well, and funds for those initiatives will flow directly through states and nonprofits, but likely an opportunity to align your efforts with these energy auditor and energy efficiency technician trainings. So I could go on all day, but I'll wrap this section with the sentiment that if the efficiency or DSM folks in your organizations are not yet looped into these IIJA discussions, ensuring that occurs will be very beneficial. And moving on to this alternative transportation note, of course, we need to talk about the $5 billion National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, or NEVI. These funds flowing to states support the strategic development of EV charging infrastructure along alternative fuel corridors. Grid capabilities and constraints will be important considerations for states in putting together their EV infrastructure deployment plans. And I know many of you are responding to RFIs from your state departments of transportation and otherwise engaging with them to inform that process and ensure that that build out occurs responsibly and in alignment with your planned investments. This kind of close coordination with your state agencies, as you know, will be important across the board for many of these opportunities. And in addition to that formula program, we have this $2.5 billion competitive program for alternative charging and fueling infrastructure, as well as over $10 billion across a couple of programs for clean and low or no emission buses, school, transit, generally public use buses. So throughout the law, many programs include alternative transportation elements. So it'll just be important in the design and execution of your transportation electrification portfolios that these are taken into account. Like for your school district customers that need to demonstrate that they have the charging infrastructure to get these competitive school bus funds, we don't want to be the bottleneck. Instead, we want to be able to help them be more competitive by offering complementary incentives. So very exciting times for TE. And we have a whole upcoming webinar on the Hydrogen Hub, so we won't dig into those here. And as we now get to the round of questions that we have prepared for our guest today, the director of the DOE Loan Program Office, or LPO, I wanted to clarify that many of the programs covered on this slide will be administered by the DOE's Office of Electricity or Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, among other offices and departments. But the LPO is working closely with these other offices, sharing their expertise to support the launch of these new programs, which in some cases we've heard are choosing to mirror some of the LPO's best practices. So given that and Mr. Shaw's experience in the private sector as well, lining up funds for efforts that advance our industry, we really look forward to getting some of his perspective and guidance here. So, hello, Jigar Shaw. I'm not getting your audio. Oh, I think we have to unmute him, Casey.
There we go. Can you hear me?
There we go. Yes.
That was a great presentation. I appreciate you guys taking me through it as well. It was great.
Thank you. So with most of the topics that we hope to cover today will relate to how these funds will flow, the level of effort required for pursuing these different opportunities, and just your practical advice for doing so successfully. But I thought it would make sense if you could start by sharing, beyond the IIJA programs that we covered, a bit about the funding opportunities administered through your office that would be applicable or of interest to utilities, so that we can reference them throughout, and in doing so, maybe clarifying the different DOE offices' alignment with early emerging tech or R&D as opposed to enabling adoption of proven solutions.
Yeah, no, it's a great opening question. In general, the Loan Programs Office was started in 2005, proposed by Pete Domenici in the 2005 Energy Act. And the main purpose of it is to recognize that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of technologies that DOE has funded over the years and have gotten to technology readiness level 7, which means it works, but is not really fully commercial, right? And so figuring out how we actually get these technologies to become fully commercial. And the Loan Programs Office was established because most commercial debt players are not interested in being first or second or third. And so they sort of want to wait to be fourth if then is the right fit for them. And so the Loan Programs Office was really fully funded in 2009 during the era stimulus, and we put about $35 billion worth of loans out the door, conditional commitments as well as loan documents out the door then, and really were largely credited for funding the first 5 solar projects above 100 megawatts, the first 5 wind farms over 250 megawatts. We funded obviously Tesla way back when, and geothermal projects as well as transmission lines. And so when you think about the role that LPO has played, it really was catalytic to unlocking trillion-dollar sectors. And I think when you think through what we have left, we have about $43 billion worth of funding left within Advanced Technology Vehicle Manufacturing Program, which is electric vehicle manufacturing, battery manufacturing, as well as critical minerals. And then you've got the Title 17 program, which is largely fossil, nuclear, and then a renewable energy and efficient energy title. And then we also run a $2 billion loan fund for tribes, which has gotten a ton of interest in the last few months. So it's been really great to see. The one other thing I would say is that a lot of what we do at the Loan Programs Office can be classified project finance, which, as you know, is quite underappreciated when it comes to normal common understanding. A lot of utilities do understand it, right? Because they sign power purchase agreements, and the folks that they work with absolutely use those power purchase agreements to then get funding to be able to complete a project. But what is that formula, which has worked for solar and wind, for instance, also works for electric vehicle buses, or works for long duration storage, or works for DER and DERMS programs, or smart transmission. And so I think a lot of what we've done recently is work a lot more closely with the utilities to figure out what those structures look like. So the most recent conditional commitment that we announced this week was for the hydrogen project at ACES in Delta, Utah. And the way in which that deal was structured was quite unique with the Interim Power Agency and LADWP. And so when you think about where we can be helpful, clearly we're a loan office, and so that's specifically where we're helpful. But what you find is that we actually have a lot of expertise around how to take these new sectors and turn them into something that's bankable.
Thank you for that. That was great. And I think that sets us up well to get a sense from you of kind of the level of effort that folks should expect in pursuing these opportunities. I think this also pairs well with one question we got from an attendee, Jason, about different funding mechanisms. So maybe if we could step through like formula grants, block grants, competitive, cooperative agreements, and loans, and however you think those could best be bucketed for these purposes, and just discuss expectations and level of effort on the part of the applicant.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Can you hear me? I know I'm having some internet trouble these days.
That's all right. Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. So in general, I think that we should keep the goal in mind, right? Which is that the president really wants to decarbonize the electricity system by 2035 and the rest of the economy by 2050. And when you think about what that means, we need roughly an extra $2.6 trillion of investment by 2035 and roughly 10 trillion by 2050. So that's roughly $300 billion of additional investment compared to business as usual, which is already pretty high. We're investing pretty heavily across the utility sector today. And so the question really becomes, like, what technologies do we need to be able to achieve these goals, right? And I think we all agree now that T&D infrastructure costs have gone way up, right? I mean, EIA put out data that shows that we've gone from roughly 2.1 cents a kilowatt hour up to like 3.8 cents a kilowatt hour in the last 10 years. And so, so we've got to figure out how to use that existing capacity more efficiently. And that, you know, requires demand response, demand flexibility, some of that work. There's also smart transmission technologies that are required. And then when you think about generation, it's not just solar and wind, but we need flexible base power plants like hydro, geothermal, nuclear, as well as like biomass plus CCS technologies and things like that. And so in each one of these technology categories, there are funds that are available for research and development demonstration. There's funds available for full-scale demonstrations. And so the differences, I would say, is that the check sizes in the early stages are probably less than $100 million, sometimes less than $20 million. And then the check sizes in the Office of Clean Energy Demonstration can easily be $500 million for those demonstrations, right? And so, and then you've got the Loan Programs Office, which is that sort of last bridge to full market acceptance. And so when you think about how all of us work together, the goal is to reach the, you know, $300 billion a year of extra investment, right? The goal is not to get a 50-50 cost share out of one particular project, but it's to say, how does this project educate all four corners of the decision makers, right? So this includes the local community, right? And figuring out how labor and justice communities and others accept a technology or want to see it pursued. You've got capital markets, right? They're always very important around, you know, what they want to support. You also have technology companies and figuring out what they can do and what risks they can take, right? Because some of them can have the balance sheet to provide a guarantee on performance and others don't. And then what role the government plays, not just in the early stage demonstration grants, the late stage demonstration grants or Loan Programs Office, but also tax credits, federal procurement, and other parts of the federal apparatus, right, permitting, et cetera. And so I would say that what's different today, as Rich suggested in his opening remarks, is that, you know, as the president said, you know, this is about the infrastructure decade, not era stimulus where we're trying to like just push the money out the door for to get people back to work, although this will create you know, millions of good paying jobs. I think the catalytic impact that we're trying to have is what we're solving for.
Okay, so Jigger, I kind of wanted to stick on the topic of financing for a little bit, because you had mentioned a couple of other financing sources, such as like capital markets. You know, what would be the difference between pursuing those avenues of financing versus going through the Loan Programs Office? Is there certain qualities of projects or certain programs you're trying to develop, certain aspects about these projects that it would be more palatable to go through the LPO versus going to the capital markets?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'll answer that question in a couple of different ways. So for the broad audience that I would answer that question for, there are a lot of places where the capital markets in general don't want to be first, second, or third, right? And so the Loan Programs Office fills the bill. Like for instance, in the Delta Utah deal that we just closed, the capital markets were basically saying, look, this is the first of a kind salt dome that's storing hydrogen, right? Whereas the 10,000 engineers, scientists, and experts at DOE were comfortable with their approach. You could imagine the commercial banks are saying, we want the fourth salt cavern, not the first one. And so there's some risk applicable to utilities, because utilities obviously.
Jigger, I think we lost some audio here for a quick second.
We can give him a second to get it resolved, but yeah, basically he left off at the part about having it be kind of a different question when you're thinking from the utility perspective. There we go.
I think we're getting him back.
We may have lost video, but that might help with the audio situation, honestly, to keep the video off. But I think while he's getting that sorted out, I mean, feel free if he's available, you can continue to pepper that information into the chat. But what we were thinking with our next question was going to be around like what he has already started
Hey
to get
guys,
at.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep,
Got
there
you.
we go.
We're switching to the phone.
Oh, alrighty.
So
Thank
sorry
you.
about that. I honestly don't
problem.
understand what's happened on the tech side of these things. But yeah, so basically on the utility side, what we're finding is that that many utilities can do new technologies, right? It's a 50-50 equity debt ratio for them usually, and they're rate basing the 50% that's equity. But you can imagine that there's a lot of concern on the part of regulators to rate base things that they view to be speculative, because they want to make sure that the ratepayer benefits really present themselves. And so a lot of utilities are coming to us with their more advanced designs because they want our approval, frankly, like our technical approval. The regulator really sees us approving something as really bringing a lot more credibility to the proposal than the utilities would bring alone. Not that the utilities are not credible, but you can imagine that we're talking about large amounts of ratepayer dollars these days. And I think the other piece of this is that we can then switch that ratio to 80% debt, 20% equity. So for many utility companies, they are having to do so many upgrades to their grid that actually they're okay with some of these things having a lower amount of equity participation, so that the impact on ratepayers is much lower.
Okay, and do you think that in the long term, then, as technology advances, and I guess the projects, the undertakings become less riskier, do you think that where do you feel like the loan program office then fits into the role of advancing kind of the technology and pushing kind of the agenda for climate change?
Well, the goal for us is, of course, is to exit stage left, right? I mean, each of these sectors that we're involved in, needs $1 trillion of capital. I mean, anything less than $1 trillion of capital, and you don't really get to gigaton scale climate reduction. And so we're never going to have $1 trillion to put out the door. So the goal for us is to be able to make sure that these first 3 or 4 loans that we put out in any one sector leads people to the level of data granularity that they need to get comfortable with the commercial markets doing the next set of projects, right? And so that is something that we plan for up front. And if we think that the sponsors that are involved are not solving for that, then we're unlikely to provide a loan.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for that. And I hadn't thought about it in terms of like the DOE being a credibility on behalf of the utility for their regulators in some of these investments. So that's a great point. And you've touched on this already, and I know it's a question that you get a lot in terms of like what are the most important criteria for an application or project to make it most attractive for DOE funding. And so we've heard you speak about the importance of transferability or the potential for a project to catalyze further industry transformation and not just address a specific need in a specific context. But if you could elaborate on that specifically in terms of how you've seen applicants best demonstrate or speak to that potential in the early stages, that would be great.
Yeah, I think that when you think about a project financing framework, what you're largely looking for is on a technical basis, right? What does the feedstock contracts look like, right? So in the Delta Utah hydrogen project, the Intermountain Power Agency was actually providing the electricity and the water for free, and then getting it tolled into a peaker plant, right? And so from that perspective, there's a feedstock issue, right? Water availability and power availability. And then you have the actual technology itself, right? In that case, the electrolyzers for the hydrogen, and then the salt cavern dome, right? And that's something that we can uniquely due diligence with our 10,000 engineers, scientists, and experts. Then you've got offtake agreements, right? In that case, you've got IPA with their offtake agreements with LAWP and others. And then you have operators, right? Like, do you actually have a credible operating staff that can be trained to do that well, right? In that case, you've got extraordinary men and women who were working at the 1,800 megawatt coal plant that could get retrained to do this, right? And so in general, those are the four technical things that we review. And then you think about like, well, who are the investors, right? Like, are they credible investors, right? Do they actually bring strategic value to the table? Are the quality of the documents such that, that this can be replicated into the future, right? Or, and things like that. And so there's a lot of those kinds of criteria. But I'd say at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is performing a commercial debt financing package, right? And so we really do try to act exactly like a commercial bank and meeting the reasonable prospect of repayment. So even though we're a public policy bank in the sense that we should be leaning in where commercial banks find things a little too risky or a little too complicated or too weird or whatever it is that they use as their excuse to not come in, we still try to use the same criteria so that after somebody gets through our office, they're likely to get through a commercial bank process.
Thank you for that. Those are, good criteria that seem like, despite the varying priorities of individual programs or eligible uses of different program funds, those could be transferable kind of across the board.
Yeah.
And I'll kick it to Rich.
So thanks, Maddie. So we kind of mentioned in the overview of the programs that some of these funds can be pursued independently by utilities, but some of them require some form of public-private partnership. Can you talk a little bit about your experience and what you've seen in terms of like a successful versus an unsuccessful partnership?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I've got easy examples of unsuccessful partnerships, but what I would say is that in general, it's not, and when you think about all the different programs that we're featuring here from, for instance, electric school buses, right? Or electric vehicle charging stations or other things, there's certainly a partnership in all of this, right? So for instance, many utilities have make-ready programs for EV chargers where they would rate base the connection of the chargers to their system, which can often be very expensive. But ultimately, you've got $7.5 billion of total funding available, not just the $5 billion that Maddie mentioned, but then another $2.5 billion for rural and justice community chargers, et cetera. And to reach the president's goal of 500,000 plugs, you're probably at something on the order of another $35 billion of private sector capital that has to be put in, which is matched by another, $5 to $8 billion worth of make ready from the utility. And so why would someone put in $35 billion to build this infrastructure, right? What are the core business models that are going to work, right? Is it charging 45 cents a kilowatt hour to charge your car at a 350 kilowatt DC fast charger? Is it workplace charging where you put in level 2 chargers where your car's parked anyway for 10 hours? Is it, putting chargers in at people's homes that have a bidirectional feature so that you can use those chargers in a way that actually helps to get better utilization out of your distribution grid, right? And like, Duke Energy, for instance, has put a lot of programs out that look like that. And so is Brian Hannigan over at Holy Cross, right? And so when you think about the different aspects of what needs to happen, the utilities have to be quite clear about what they want to do around the future of selling electrons, right? We all know that electrons have been basically flat from 2003 till today in terms of sales. And so now we're talking about doubling or tripling the amount of sales that the utilities are going to be making through 2035. That's how we're going to decarbonize our economy, is through more heat pumps and more, replacing gasoline with electricity and all these other things, right? And I think you and I both know that if we build out our T&D infrastructure in the exact same way that we did the last 20 years, we're definitely going to bankrupt everybody. And so we have to figure out smarter ways of managing load and getting much better asset utilization of the T&D. And that might mean, demand flexibility. But all of that requires clear signals from both parties, right? So the business models have to tell the utilities, well, here's how we're going to make money. And the utilities have to say, well, here's how we're going to structure our rate tariffs to make sure that you don't break our systems, right? And everyone has to work together to make sure that each party's needs are met, right? And largely what we're talking about with the public-private partnership, right? So, and that's also true for electric vehicles. It's also true for smart transmission, right? I think we all know that if we build out the full transmission grid to accommodate all of the renewable energy that we want to accommodate, right, that we're likely going to have to spend over $100 billion for new transmission capacity, and that's even harder to build than nuclear plants. And so then the question is, do we need more flexible baseload power, right, like nuclear or geothermal or hydro or other things? And if we do, that's great, but then, how do we support the utilities in doing that? So for instance, several utilities have come to me and said, look, Jigger, we can put all this stuff in our integrated resource plan, but we actually need DOE to do a study that shows that this is the lowest cost way for us to comply with decarbonization by 2035, because a lot of the community groups in our territory don't believe us, right? They really think that you can just 100% wind and solar run the grid with batteries, and our modeling is showing that that's 40% more expensive than the lowest cost approach, right? And so DOE needs to be helpful to, validate what we're saying, right? And so there's a lot of public-private partnerships here, and it depends on the sector. But there are a lot of opportunities for us to partner to make sure that, again, that the level of buy-in that the utilities are getting for these radical transformations is there.
So you talk. So I want to touch a little bit on something you just said about kind of what the transmission infrastructure and the interconnection queue challenges. We did have a question from Lisa in our listening audience about these challenges, especially with renewables. So we've got a lot of renewables ready to come online, and there's just these issues with getting them onto the grid. Can you talk a little bit about what else your office might be doing to help assist in this area?
Well, I mean, my office is a loan office, right? So the largest transmission line projects are in my office, and I certainly have other projects that have come in to apply for our money as well. But the government writ large is working hard. Like FERC just put out a very large NOPR on these issues to help guide streamlining the decision-making process for interconnection. Clearly, DOE has a very large new initiative out of IIJA around the grid infra office and other, sort of like mechanisms that we have around anchor tenant support. We also have, I think, over $3 billion for smart grid technologies, which I think we just issued the RFI for that yesterday. So, people should provide their best comments around, what's really holding them back from deploying these technologies that, as you know, have largely been deployed in the UK, India, Brazil, South Africa, but the US is sort of the last country to do this at scale. And so, so what's holding people back, right? And how can we use that money to move things forward? And so I do think that there are a lot of solutions, but this is again where I think the quality of communication needs to be higher, right? And so if, for instance, if you really do need, 4 hours of battery storage on every one of these units to be able to unlock things, that's great. But there's also a lot of pitfalls. Like, for instance, there's been a bunch of stories in California recently where California ISO is viewing batteries as being able to discharge and charge, and they're not going to claim which way people would go. And so battery storage projects in curtailed areas are being denied because they're saying, well, they could, discharge at the wrong time. And you're like, well, why would anyone do that? Like, if you're in a curtailment situation, you're by definition going to be charging, right? And you have negative LMP rates. And they're like, well, but technically they could, have software that's opposite. I'm like, well, there's lots of ways of protecting the utility and the grid from that, like where you can say no export when we actually have this kind of signal or whatever it is. And so I think that some of these things are not nefarious by any one party, but it is holding us back from confidently getting iron in the ground.
Definitely. And I do want to make sure that we're peppering in some of these questions that we've gotten from attendees. So I might change course for us a little bit here, though that might be a topic that we want to get back to. But we're interested, I know you won't be able to comment on like the representation across applications coming in for these IIJA programs, but maybe just from your experience with potential borrowers from LPO, if you recognize any significant disparities among the applicants you're seeing as opposed to what you know about the market as a whole. We got a question from an attendee specifically about geographic disparities, but I'm also curious about certain organization types as opposed to others. So I know we have both large IOUs and smaller municipal utilities on the call. So anything you'd comment on there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can answer it a couple ways. One is that in the 2020 Energy Act, the Loan Programs Office has a requirement of being geographically diverse. So we do check this regularly, and we actually are amazingly diverse. And so we're getting applications in from, I think, 60% of the states throughout the country. So, so from that perspective, I think we are covering many states and, you know, of various sizes and shapes and locations across the country. So we're very proud of that. I think in terms of the different pots of money, I would say that it depends on the pot of money, right? Clearly, the hydrogen hub work is being done in two ways, right? One is in places where you actually already have very high emissions. You know, there's a lot of industrial hubs that want to use hydrogen to decarbonize their hub. And then the second is there are a lot of places that actually have natural benefits to hydrogen, right? Like we just discussed in Delta, Utah, where they have a salt cavern right there. And so there are like 12 or 15 additional salt domes that are known that could be used. And so, so there's two different strategies, right? One is bringing the clean hydrogen production to existing industrial places. And the other is making clean hydrogen and storing it in the cheapest possible geographical place, and then moving the industrial capacity to you know, where that is, right? And so I think you're going to have a little bit of both, but in that case, you're going to have some restriction of some states to participate because some states have neither criteria in their category. But then you've got direct air capture hubs, you've got over $1 billion for low impact hydro, you've got, you know, money for geothermal. So there really is something for everybody. And so I think that the goal is to convince the utility companies that this is their moment, right? They don't have to show leadership on any one issue that people are telling them to show leadership on, but they shouldn't miss out on the opportunity to show leadership on something. So I've got, for instance, 12 utilities I'm working with actively right now who have determined that the best use for their old coal plant or natural gas plant that they're already announced decommissioning dates around 2028, 2029 now, they're going to convert them to nuclear plants. And they're working hard to do that, and they're spending the $50 million for the early site permit with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, et cetera, right? And so we're supporting them on that. So I don't think there is an actual you know, set of technologies that we're pushing on utilities as much as saying, here are the 62 new programs coming out of IIJA. We have money for all of them. Like, it doesn't matter what your preference is. I'm pretty sure that we can help you.
That's great to hear. And on that note, I mean, apart from receiving funding from your office and participating directly in other DOE funded initiatives, could you share a bit about whether and how utilities can learn from and apply the information that comes out of your due diligence process as you evaluate and report on other innovative projects in the space?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of sensitivity, obviously, that we have to be careful about. I mean, a lot of the information that we receive is business confidential. Mm-hmm. So I can't just publish it all on a website and say, here's everybody's secrets. But what I do in general is provide a lot of podcasts and articles and that kind of stuff about the lessons that we're learning out of each experience. And so most recently on the hydrogen project we just completed with the Delta, Utah conditional commitment, we just did a podcast that aired today on Catalyst from Canary Media around all the different details that I could share about exactly how that project was put together. And I did the same thing with the monolith materials deal in Halem, Nebraska back last December. And so we are trying to get all of the best practices that we can learn and share out of that work into the hands of utilities and other interested stakeholders. So for instance, we partner with the American Gas Association, or some of the EEI. We just did a big event with EEI that Tom Kuhn attended over at Guggenheim Investment Partners on small modular reactors. And a lot of our best content was featured at that conference, right? And so I think that we're trying really hard to share everything we can that's not business confidential, but you can imagine that, some folks believe that they have a more interesting proprietary approach than the next person.
Definitely. And it's working the way it's going, because I had at least 3 or 4 people forward me that Canary Media article this morning. So it's getting the word around.
Thank you.
And I'll maybe turn it over to Rich to ask one last question. And then maybe after a few minutes, I want to make sure that our guest has a chance to kind of get out any thoughts that aren't bounded by our questions for this audience, and then we'll wrap it up. So I'll hand it over to Rich.
So there's one more question I had, and this is kind of in relation to a previous podcast you had. You mentioned in the past that it could take around 500 hours or so for an application with the federal government for some of these programs. Can you talk a little bit about what goes into that 500 hours and what kind of effort is involved?
Yeah, it's a great question. In general, it's not 500 hours to start the process. I'd say it's more like 500 hours to get to a full application, in part 2. But basically, the first thing we do is we have to check for greenhouse gas emission savings and innovation, right? So people have to fill out those parts of the form, which is only a small subset of the form. We have to fill that out, right? And then we can come back in and tell people that they qualify for the office. Once they qualify, then we are a commercial bank, basically, right? So you're basically saying, here's the 85 documents I need, including a full business model around what the reasonable prospect of repayment might be here. And then once that process is completed, and we also have to do a NEPA review on all of our projects, right, to make sure that we're consulting with stakeholders, local tribes, as well as environmental regulations. But then, there's lots of questions that come up, which is like, hey, you're selling green ammonia as your offtake agreement. What's the predicted price for green ammonia for the next 10 years? Like, do we have to hire an independent third party to give us a curve on that? Oh, you're using the low carbon fuel standard credit program in California, right, for your renewable natural gas plants. Okay, well then how do we think that's going to perform? Or there's lots of questions that come in, and then there's back and forth. But remember, our average loan size in our office is $930 million, right? And our median loan size is $530 million. So these are generally not small projects. We really are at, billion-dollar scale for the projects, and then, heading towards trillion-dollar scale for gigaton scale reduction. And so, 500 hours seems like a lot, but, these are very complicated and important projects. So we haven't found people to be shy about putting that kind of time into things.
No, when you put it that way, it totally makes sense.
Definitely. And yeah, like I mentioned before, we wrap up, just noting the remaining time. I wanted to make sure you had a chance, unbounded by our questions, to just share any message that you would like with the utility audience here with respect to these IIJA opportunities in particular. So any parting thoughts for us?
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that I think that we are at a moment where DOE has prepared itself for 45 years, right? DOE was created out of the Arab oil crisis in the 1970s. And we're currently moving into an energy crisis today, right, as the Secretary suggested publicly in her media appearances yesterday. And so DOE has thousands of technologies that we've invented for just this moment, right? And there are pathways by which we can actually have electricity rate reductions, right? I think there's a lot of people who believe that we are now fighting against either 10% cost increases per year or 1% cost increases per year. But I'm here to say that I think the technologies exist to actually make that negative, right? And I think that that requires a wholesale change in the way we think about things, right? 1/15 of all of our appliances throughout your utility territory are replaced every year. Many low, moderate income consumers are paying 30% interest for a new refrigerator or water heater when it breaks because they need something right away, and that's what's available to them. We have proven models around utility on-bill financing mechanisms, pay-as-you-save models, unsecured financing through partnerships with, solar financial technology companies. There's lots of ways to solve these really big conundrums, but we can't just not solve them, right? Like, I'm not suggesting you have to solve them in a certain way. There are 10 different ways to solve them, but you have to pick one of the 10, because otherwise it looks like you're not being responsive to ratepayer needs. And I think that's where we are today. There are a lot of people buying electric vehicles. We have to figure out how to integrate those electric vehicles into distribution circuits without just increasing the size of the distribution circuit and reducing its asset utilization down to 27%. When you do that, every cost go up for everybody, right? But when you say, well, we'll integrate it for you, but we're forcing you to put in a bidirectional charger so that we can actually make sure that you're not charging at the absolute peak times of the day, right? There's lots of things that we can do, and there's lots of approaches that we can take, and DOE is here to help. And so if you have questions and you're not sure which other utilities have tried this before and what the results were of the pilot or whatever else, ask us. You don't need to do your own pilot. They've all been done before, all of them. And we're now ready for deployment at scale. And we're here to help you deploy at scale, but don't believe that you're all by yourself here. We're really here to help, and let us know how we can do that.
That's great to hear. Thank you so much. Thanks for answering all of our questions, a lot of the attendees' questions. We just really appreciate you joining us today. And I'll turn it over to Rich to close us out.
Thanks. And first, again, Jager, thank you for answering all of our questions and providing us with the insight and some guidance on how folks in our audience should really take the approach to the opportunities available under the IIJA, as well as other opportunities available through your office. And we just want to reinforce with the folks listening in that there's a lot of coordination and communication that you've mentioned that needs to be happening right now in anticipation for the announcements coming, and that utilities should be making the efforts now to evaluate the projects, looking for partnerships, communicating with your office, with others in the DOE, and with other stakeholders that might be involved to put together the pieces needed to go after this funding when it becomes available. So we hope that this discussion has helped in providing that guidance. And with that, Casey, I'll turn it over to you to close us out.
Thanks so much, Rich. We just wanted to let you guys know about a couple upcoming things we have going on. Our next webinar, as was mentioned earlier, is all about the hydrogen hubs and a vision for hydrogen-based economy. That is coming up on Tuesday, May 10th. All of you that are currently on this webinar and those that registered but aren't able to attend today will be receiving a link to these slides that or this recording that we did today. And then also it will have a link to register for that Hydrogen Hubs webinar if you so choose and are interested. And then we'd be remiss to not mention that we are going to be at Distributech. We'll be on the show floor, booth 2642 at the show, but then we're also hosting 2 events, which again, if you're on this webinar, you will be receiving an invitation to that next Tuesday-ish, Wednesday next week. If you're not going, please just regard, but if your utility is going and you know someone that would like to utilize your invitation, please feel free to send it along to them. We do have as you see on the screen, the breakfast panel that we're going to be doing, and then also kind of a happy hour networking event later in the day on that Tuesday. So with that, here's some of our contact information. As I mentioned, the recording will be sent around by tomorrow morning. And we really appreciate all of you taking time out of your day to join us. And again, if you have any questions, reach out to those on the screen, and we appreciate your time. Thank you.